Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You are chosen because you're deep, not weak. That sentence alone has the power to shift your entire narrative if you let it. For a long time, you may have believed that what happened to you, being caught in the emotional hurricane of someone else's dysfunction, was a reflection of your own shortcomings. Maybe you told yourself, I should have known better, I should have left sooner, I shouldn't have fallen for it. But what if the truth is something else entirely? What if the very qualities that made you susceptible to manipulation were actually the most sacred parts of you? People with depth tend to see the best in others. They extend grace, sometimes longer than they should. They assume the best intentions, they forgive easily, and they listen deeply. They feel with their whole hearts. And when you feel that deeply, when you're wired for connection, it's easy to mistake someone else's craving for control as a cry for help. It's easy to confuse dysfunction for vulnerability, and it's heartbreakingly easy to try to fix, to stay, to rescue. But here's the truth no one tells you at the beginning. People who manipulate and control are not looking for equals. They're looking for mirrors, someone who reflects their greatness back to them without demanding accountability. And they often find these mirrors in people like you. People who are emotionally intelligent, compassionate, and invested in growth. You weren't chosen because you lacked strength. You were chosen because you had it in abundance, just not yet directed toward yourself. There is no shame in being open-hearted. But if no one ever taught you that your empathy needed boundaries or that your compassion wasn't an unlimited resource, then of course you'd offer too much. Of course you'd believe their pain meant they deserved your healing. But healing never works that way. Love doesn't fix people who refuse to see they're broken. And your soul wasn't meant to be a repair shop for someone else's unexamined wounds. Still, you stayed. Maybe because you remembered their story and rationalized their actions. Maybe because you thought, if I can love them hard enough, they'll change. Or maybe because every time you considered leaving, they reminded you of just enough hope to make staying feel like the noble thing. But eventually, something inside you broke, and not in the way they said it would. Not because you were too sensitive or too emotional or too much. It broke because you finally realized you were sacrificing your peace just to maintain their comfort. And that's when everything changes. That's when the narrative begins to rewrite itself. You begin to understand that what felt like weakness was really you being strong in the wrong direction. That your loyalty isn't a flaw, it just needs to be earned. That your ability to love deeply isn't something to be ashamed of, it's just something that requires discernment. You learn that boundaries aren't walls to keep people out, they're the lines that keep you intact. This wasn't punishment, this wasn't a sign that you're broken or that you attract toxicity, it was an awakening. You were placed in that relationship to understand the sacredness of your own energy, to learn the difference between giving love and abandoning yourself. You were meant to learn where you end and someone else begins, and that the cost of peace should never be your own voice. So yes, it hurts deeply, and yes, it can feel like betrayal by them and sometimes even by yourself. But grief is honest, and from that honesty, something fierce begins to grow. The kind of clarity that doesn't scream or blame, but simply refuses to participate in its own erasure. The kind of strength that no longer needs to prove itself through sacrifice. You start to trust your gut again. You start to understand your worth, not in spite of what happened, but because you lived through it and came out knowing more about yourself than you ever would have otherwise. You were chosen because you are deep, not weak. And that depth is your gift, your power, and your responsibility. Don't silence it. Don't shrink it, just guard it fiercely and give it only where it's met with truth, honor, and equal courage. Would you like the next keynote expanded as well? Your boundaries were a lesson you were meant to learn, not as punishment and not because you failed, but because somewhere along the way you were taught that love meant giving more than you had, saying yes when you meant no, and tolerating what hurt just to keep the peace. And that kind of lesson doesn't come in a textbook. It comes through fire. It comes through people who press and test and take until you have no choice but to ask yourself the hardest question of all. Where do I end and where do they begin? In relationships where one person dominates the space with their needs, their moods, their control, boundaries don't just get ignored, they get erased. Slowly, subtly, they convince you that their reactions are your responsibility. Their unhappiness becomes your failure. Their silence becomes your punishment. And somewhere in all of that confusion, you stop protecting your own energy. You stop asking yourself what you want. You learn to anticipate them instead of listening to yourself. And that is the moment the boundary lesson begins. Not with clarity, but with the ache of losing yourself peacefully. It's easy to look back and think, I should have said no sooner. I should have stood up for myself. I should have left. But guilt is not the teacher here. Awareness is. You didn't fail because your boundaries were tested. You grew because you finally realized they existed. That's the shift. That's where the power begins to return. Because when you begin to see how often you've been bending yourself into shapes that weren't yours, you also begin to remember what it feels like to stand up straight again. Learning boundaries doesn't always look like drawing a clean line and walking away. Sometimes it starts with tiny decisions. It starts with, I don't have to answer this text right now. It starts with, no, I don't feel like explaining myself today. It starts with, I am allowed to take up space even if it makes someone else uncomfortable. These are not acts of rebellion. They're acts of remembering, acts of reclamation, and they're rarely easy, especially when you've been conditioned to believe that being kind means being available at all times, especially when someone has trained you to doubt your own instincts. You'll question yourself. You'll second guess your right to take care of your needs. And if you're like most of us, you'll feel guilty for finally choosing yourself. But here's the hard truth wrapped in love. If you weren't taught how to have boundaries, then you were almost certainly taught how to abandon yourself. So when you start to reclaim your time, your voice, your energy, it will feel like selfishness. It will feel like rejection. It might even feel like loss. That's normal. That's the shedding of old patterns. That's the discomfort of growth. It's also where your power begins to surface, not the loud, aggressive kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need to explain or convince. The kind that walks away from manipulation without making a scene. The kind that says, I am still kind, I am still loving, but I will not betray myself for your comfort anymore. Eventually something shifts inside you. You begin to recognize the difference between people who respect your boundaries and people who only respect what they can get from you. You stop seeing your sensitivity as a flaw and start seeing it as a filter, something precious that deserves protection. You begin to realize that love without boundaries is not love. It's codependence, it's performance, it's a life lived on someone else's. Another lesson, this boundary lesson, is sacred. Not because it was fair, but because it was necessary. You were meant to learn what it feels like to listen to your own voice above the noise. You were meant to learn that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of self-respect. You were meant to learn that your worth is not negotiable, even if someone else tries to bargain with it. So, no, you weren't broken because your boundaries were once weak. You were simply waiting for the moment when you'd be ready to stop shrinking and start showing up for yourself. That moment came when you saw the cost of silence. And from there you began the quiet, powerful work of drawing the line not just for them, but for you. Would you like me to continue with the third keynote next? Your pain became the blueprint for your power. Not in the moment it happened, not in the breaking, the unraveling, the confusion, but in the aftermath, when you chose to face the truth instead of running from it. Pain has a way of stripping everything down to what's real. It peels back the performance, the pretending, the pleasing, and in its rawness, it introduces you to who you are beneath the roles you played for survival. There's a moment that comes after the storm when everything is quiet but unfamiliar. You've walked away or been left behind, or simply woken up one day and realized that nothing fits anymore. That the version of you that once tolerated the intolerable is gone. That the lies you told yourself to keep the peace don't work anymore. That your heart is tired, not just from what was done to you, but from everything you did to keep pretending you were okay. And yet here you are. Not because you ignored the pain, but because you faced it. Not because you healed overnight, but because you chose, day after painful day, not to go numb. You chose to sit with the discomfort, to examine the story, to ask the hard questions. Why did I accept that? What did I believe about myself that made that feel like love? What part of me thought I had to earn what should have been freely given? These questions are not weakness. They are a kind of bravery that most people spend their lives avoiding. Pain isn't the enemy, denial is. Pretending something didn't hurt doesn't make you strong, it makes you stuck. But you didn't stay stuck. Somewhere along the way, you stopped trying to go back to who you were before it all, because you realized that version of you was never the goal. The goal was becoming who you were always meant to be, the version of you who no longer tolerates what hurts, who no longer explains away mistreatment, who no longer minimizes her voice to keep someone else comfortable. That power didn't come from a self-help book or a perfect morning routine. It came from your own bones, from crying in parking lots and walking out of rooms you used to beg to be seen in, from waking up one morning and realizing you'd rather be alone than feel lonely in someone else's presence. Your pain laid the foundation and you built something real on top of it. There's a kind of wisdom you earn when you've been through the fire and refuse to let it harden you. That's the difference. You didn't become bitter, you became better at knowing what's worth your time. You don't lose your softness, you just stop offering it to people who see it as an invitation to take. You still have your empathy, your love, your warmth, but now you hold it differently. You don't hand it out as proof of your worth. You offer it from a place of knowing who you are. And that's the blueprint. That's what makes your power different. It isn't loud, it doesn't demand attention, it simply exists, grounded in truth and self-trust. People feel it when you walk into a room. It's in the way you say no without guilt. It's in the way you don't chase validation anymore. It's in the way you no longer shape-shift to be loved. None of this happened because someone saved you. It happened because you saved yourself. Because you got tired of betraying your own soul, because the pain finally became louder than your fear, and instead of running from it, you leaned in. You looked your story in the eye and said, "You don't own me anymore." You see, power born from pain doesn't need permission. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't even need to be understood. It simply is. It becomes the quiet compass that guides you, the inner voice that says, never again. Not in bitterness, but in clarity. Not in revenge, but in resilience. You didn't just survive, you transformed. And that transformation, that blueprint of lessons etched in every scar, becomes something you carry into the rest of your life. It's how you teach others what love is supposed to feel like. It's how you raise the standard for every space you enter. It's how you become the kind of person who refuses to let pain go to waste. Would you like the final keynote expanded next? You were meant to interrupt the pattern. That's not just a comforting idea, it's the truth hiding behind the chaos you lived through. When you found yourself in that relationship, in that painful dynamic that pulled you so far from yourself, it wasn't random, it wasn't fate punishing you or the universe playing some cruel trick. It was an invitation, not to suffer, but to see. Not to stay, but to wake up. You were placed in that space so you could notice what no one else wanted to name. So you could feel the ache of what has been repeated for far too long and then make a different choice. Patterns run deep. They live in families, in cultures, in unspoken rules. Sometimes they show up as silence. Sometimes they show up as control, as manipulation dressed as love, or as loyalty that comes with a price. You might have watched it play out before, maybe in your parents, your grandparents, or the people you trusted when you were too young to know better. You might have internalized it, believing that love always comes with a condition, that care is something you have to earn, or that your needs are always too much. But then it happened to you, and everything got loud. That pain you couldn't explain, that tension between what you felt and what you were told, that inner voice that kept whispering, this isn't right. That was your signal. That was your moment of recognition, the place where the pattern became visible. And while it may have felt like the lowest point, it was also your point of power. Because you saw it, you felt it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's where disruption begins. You weren't meant to play along. You were meant to pause the cycle, to look at the story you inherited or absorbed and ask the question no one else dared to. Is this what love really looks like? Is this what I want to pass on? That question is revolutionary. It doesn't just shift your life, it shifts every life that comes after yours. It's legacy work. And legacy work doesn't start in comfort, it starts in courage. Interrupting a pattern is lonely sometimes, because the moment you stop playing your old role, pleaser, fixer, silent observer, you'll feel resistance. People who benefited from the old version of you won't always celebrate your growth. That's okay. Let them be uncomfortable. Let the silence stretch. Let the space widen. Because the pattern is losing power, and that loss will echo before it settles. And as hard as it is, as isolating as it can feel, you're not alone. The truth is, many people live inside these loops for years, decades, never realizing they have a choice. You had a choice. And even if you didn't feel like you made it consciously at first, your spirit did. You pulled away, you spoke up, you left, or you drew the line, or you finally said the thing no one wanted to say. That was you interrupting what was never meant to continue through you. And it doesn't stop with just leaving or cutting someone off. Interrupting the pattern means healing what it left behind. It means facing your triggers, reworking your beliefs, and relearning what safe, mutual, respectful connection feels like. It's not glamorous work. It's often messy and exhausting and unacknowledged. But every time you choose awareness over autopilot, compassion over compliance, or truth over silence, you're doing the work. You're laying down a new path. And this new path, it doesn't just serve you, it teaches your friends, your children, your community what's possible. It shows them what self-trust looks like, what emotional responsibility looks like, what boundaries that don't need justification look like. It gives people permission to choose something better because they saw you do it first. So no, this isn't just your story. It's bigger than that. You are the turning point. You are the moment the old way ends and something new begins. That's not a burden. It's a calling. And no matter how painful or unfair the journey has been, that role is sacred. You didn't ask for the wound, but you chose the healing. And in that choice, you became the interruption the world needed. Would you like help turning all 4 keynote expansions into a full speech?